Hi, everyone. Welcome back to our conversation about conflicts. Today, we're going to get into the root causes of conflicts. But before we do that, let's take a quick look back at our last conversation where we talked about how conflict is when you have two or more opposing parties with different opinions, agendas, objectives, perhaps opposing values and desires. Back in that last conversation, we also talked about how not all conflict is bad and that some conflict can actually be quite good and have a great outcome. The difference is whether the conflict is constructive or destructive. I'm Patrick Casseday, and I'm an executive coach, learning and HR partner for global Fortune 500 companies. Martin?
Hello, everyone. So I'm Martin Jessen, and I advise organizations on HR strategy and transformations. So based in San Francisco and have worked in multiple HR leadership roles in IBM and Schneider Electric. So today, as Patrick said, we are going to dig deeper into the root causes of conflict. Understanding the source of the conflict will really be critical to figure out how to resolve them. Okay, so first we'll look at common root causes for conflict in a business environment, and then we'll lay out the mechanisms on how we interpret and deal with conflicts. So Patrick, can you start us off with the most common root causes, please?
Thanks, Martin. So let's take a look at these root causes. We'll not go into all the societal or personal relationship topics that can cause conflicts. Instead, I think we want to focus on the ones that you'll most likely encounter in a business environment. There are a few that I'll go through pretty quickly, so we can focus on the one at the end that I think is more interesting and likely more common in business than I think we realize. So if you were to think about the conflicts you've had in the past, you'll likely find that you can identify with one or more of these root causes. The first is conflict about needs. This is when resources are scarce. Essentially, when people compete for resources, recognition, or power, conflict can occur. Because everyone needs a share of these resources to complete their jobs, whether that's funding, headcount, development time, or other scarce items, it's obvious why this can lead to conflict. So the next is when people approach one another in problems in different manners based on their behavioral style. If you've ever taken a personality or behavioral profile like DISC, MBTI, Insights Discovery, you know that how you approach a situation is often different from how others do. Understanding your own style and recognizing the different style in others can go a long way toward helping you find a resolution to conflict. So for example, you could be a quick decision maker and working with someone who processes things internally. Just because they're not answering you doesn't mean that they're disagreeing with you. If you misunderstand that that's the reason why they're responding the way they are, it could absolutely lead to a conflict. On the other hand, understanding this can help you determine how you should handle it. So now we come to when people have conflicting goals, pressures, and roles. When an employee has to work together with someone else and they have goals that don't align with each other, or when they have pressures from their boss or other stakeholder that pull them in different directions, or the roles they each have different strategic direction, conflict can arise. So here's a quick example. Let's say I'm a salesperson with a goal to sell 10 million of a product or solution, and I'm trying to sell that in a particular part of the world. And I encounter the regional business leader for that area who tells me that his organization won't spend any time with that customer because it's not in their country targets. So I clearly have a conflict of goals or pressures or role. It probably doesn't matter which in that case.
So maybe the first thing to consider in a case like this is whether complete transparency about goals and objectives are in order. Yeah? I think this is something we can really dig into in our next video, no?
Yeah, Martin, I think you're exactly right on both counts. An open, honest conversation about goals and priorities would be a super useful solution in this case, or at least the beginning to a solution, and it's a great topic for our next chat. So I'd like to spend a moment on personal values as a source of conflict. Personal values are definitely a complex and emotional topic, and in the current environment, they're even more thought-provoking. In a way, the fact that we're all currently working remotely may be to our benefit in seeing workplace conflict around personal values kept to a minimum. In any workplace, it's likely that people of different backgrounds, upbringing, cultures, and religions are coming together in tight quarters. These values can sometimes bump against one another and start conflicts.
Patrick, is there a cultural aspect to this as well?
Martin, I definitely think there can be, because I've experienced it. Uh, what I experienced was this. You may have heard of this concept called individualism versus collectivism. So, as you can tell from my complete lack of accent, I'm an American. When my family and I moved to Paris a number of years ago, I struggled a bit when I got there, starting to work with some of my European colleagues. One of the first things I was working on there was this team project on employer branding. So after a month or so, 6 weeks or so, I realized I was getting stuck. I wasn't making any progress in the team, and I felt like everything I was doing or suggesting was running into a brick wall or was getting shot down. And I didn't know why. I was super focused on the parts I was responsible for and thought I was doing a good job. I mean, I know I was getting shot down, but at the same time, I knew that I was meeting my deadlines, I was getting things done, I was delivering on my part of the project. But I couldn't figure out why I wasn't getting anywhere with the team. So then one day we were in a meeting, full team meeting, discussing the project, and a topic I'd been working on came up, and my French boss, rather than taking my suggestion, and I will say it was a fantastic suggestion. She said that, hey, let's have another meeting to talk about this suggestion that I'd made to make a decision about it. I was like, wait, what, another meeting? But I realized after thinking about it at that point that I'd been approaching everything the wrong way. The problem was that I'd been focused very much on my goals and objectives as a means to make the team successful. Well, the team I was working with was focused on the team's objectives as a means to achieve their own individual success. So this was that individualism versus collectivism values mismatch. Despite all the cultural training that I went to prior to my expat assignment, I'd fallen into that trap that they'd warned me about and was only viewing things from my perspective. Once I came to that realization, I was able to change how I was approaching things and get past that conflict that I was experiencing.
Yes, I remember when you arrived there in Paris, you were a bit of a bull in a china shop, yeah?
Yeah, without a doubt. Fortunately, I figured it out before too much damage was done. So one more source of conflict that I think is very much in the news today is trust, or rather a lack of trust. Whether it's because trust has been broken or not established, a lack of trust between parties can lead to conflict. It can cause each side to withhold information, not engage in open and transparent discussions, or to put their own interest ahead of the collective. So, for example, you may have been in a situation where you don't have the confidence that the other person is up to the task at hand, and you don't trust that they will get the job done. Or you could have been in a situation where the other person has stabbed you in the back, or maybe taken credit for the work that you've done in the past. These both would likely cause a lack of trust and could be a cause of conflict. Now, I'd like to get to one final cause of conflict that's somewhat inherent in business structure and in human nature simultaneously, and that's this us versus them mentality. Now, I recognize that that's a bit of a simplistic name, but I think it'll make sense as we explain it. The us versus them mentality is that there's a formation of collective behavior that seems to stem from the organizational structures of the workplace itself. Now, don't get me wrong, it's not necessarily the organization or the company's fault. For thousands of years, human mind has had a tendency to categorize people into social groups. And current research on this behavior has shown that people tend to favor group bias, even when they're categorized on relatively meaningless distinctions like eye color, hair color, or whatever kind of drink they may like.
Don't we see this also in our current politics?
Yeah, exactly. We identify with groups labeled conservative or liberal, or in sports, we identify with a particular team. And the result of that grouping is that the side we identify with becomes the us, and everyone else becomes the them. That thinking of ourselves in terms of us and them groups automatically leads to a preference. You prefer your group to the other. In other words, we're better than they are, so who are they to tell me how to do what I need to do? So let's take that into a business environment where there are departments and operating divisions, corporate headquarters, regional divisions, or business units. The people working for any of those structures have a tendency to create an us group based on the structure they belong to. And by default then, the people in those other groups becomes them. This creates a kind of tension, and that's the source of conflict. So we see this all the time in those intra-company battles between, regional versus corporate, sales versus engineering, manufacturing versus sales, and apparently it's always sales' fault, finance versus marketing, or in acquisitions with the acquiring company versus the acquired. That kind of group thinking causes us to act irrationally because we're more concerned about conforming with our group instead of thinking for ourselves. In other words, we serve the interest of our groups instead of listening to what the others have to say, merely because they come from that them or other group. Ultimately, we fail to focus on what the greater good for the company might be. And what's interesting, this also shows up in employee engagement surveys when we ask about collaboration or that willingness to work with others outside of our own us team. Collaboration is consistently rated one of the lower scores on those surveys, but amongst the most important for companies to have. To put it bluntly, this us versus them mentality epitomizes the quote, "We have met the enemy and he is us." So now that I've laid out some of the common causes for conflict in a business setting, Martin, can you take us into the mechanisms for how we interpret these conflicts?
Yes, Patrick, let me try. So I think we can all agree that conflicts can become a very personal experience. Okay. In the first podcast, we spoke about an arousal, which is a good expression. It can be an emotional thing where you perhaps feel the adrenaline, your head is blushing, your leg is going up and down, your stomach is perhaps contracting. This is where I feel, oh, yes, this is getting somehow personal. Okay. This is where I find it really helpful to reflect on a conflict and look closer at how am I actually interpreting this situation? How am I making sense of what is happening? How am I processing this? Okay. And the real smart thing to do, which is so hard to many of us, is how is the other person interpreting and making sense of this situation? Trying to put yourself into the shoes of that other person. So there's a lot of potential in that exercise of reflection to unlock a tough situation. It facilitates empathy and an evaluation of what has brought you and your counterpart into this conflict, and perhaps it gives you some clues on how to resolve it.
So Martin, I like this construct. You're saying that people are different, and especially in conflicts, it becomes very apparent that we process information differently. In other words, what upsets you may not upset your colleague. What you value as extremely important may not be important at all to someone else. But why is that?
So when I was studying at university, I came across this theory around sense-making in organization, which continues to fascinate me today. So when you make sense of a situation, you refer to a framework on how you see the world. Those are kind of the patterns of your lived experiences, how things are connected and how they interact with each other. So in that framework, you then have yourself, you see your identity, you're playing a certain role in that world, and that context shapes how you interpret and how you engage in that situation.
So Martin, essentially what you're saying is that you're going about your business and you're sensing the environment around you. Things are happening that you expect. You're playing your role. Other people are playing the roles you expect them to. And then poof, something unexpected happens. I think we need an example.
So copy that. So let me tell you about one example. So in one of my jobs, I was deploying strategic workforce planning across multiple businesses where we believed that would really be of value. Okay, I embarked on setting up meetings with the business leaders and the HR business partners to introduce the concept and method. And generally, those meetings really went well with good interactions. There was debate, there was feedback, and really some fruitful meetings that kind of took us to deployment. Okay, but one of those meetings really took a different turn. Okay, especially the business leader. So while he was clearly present and at the meeting, it was very quiet. And when I asked kind of probing questions, there were only one syllable kind of responses, and I wasn't really getting anywhere, and no support, or at least some sort of rebuke on this effort. Okay, so instead of a bang, it was really like hitting into a duvet. Okay, Patrick, this is what you meant by passive aggressive, no? I felt the meeting was going nowhere, and really went with my intuition to say, hey, I let you think about it, and perhaps we can reconnect in a week or so. And really, quite disappointedly, I hung up, and with this little knot in my stomach, as this was a big and crucial business with high expectations also from my own management that we would come up with a good people plan. Okay. So interestingly, I did not call him back after a week, but chose not to put more efforts into this business. Yeah, which, by the way, came back to haunt me when senior management asked me, how was I getting on with planning for this business? But the interesting piece is how I ended up not calling him back, and I think sense making really offers an interesting perspective on this. So after I hung up, my sense making kicked in, and kind of climbing around my framework of lived experiences, and there were a couple of reasons coming up. So perhaps the business really didn't need a workforce plan, and perhaps the business leader was preoccupied with something more important. Maybe there were some other priorities.
Hey, Martin, perhaps it was the business leader didn't like corporate schmucks like you and me to come in with great advice, no added value, and no idea what it's like in the field.
Yes, exactly. I found a number of other ideas, and I kind of either included this in a list of my possibilities, or dismissed them. So I eventually honed in on this combination. I have other priorities, or the business has other priorities. And to your point, I'm not into corporate schmucks explanation. Yeah, so that was kind of the combination of my sense making of that situation. But why did I then not try to still convince him otherwise? And here I think this identity dimension of sense making offers a quite an interesting perspective. So while I had sympathy for him having other priorities, I felt offended by being labeled a corporate schmuck. Yeah? Even though he was never explicit on this, this was purely my mind creating that explanation. And it's super fascinating how I observe my brain just going off the rails with this interpretation that then basically ended up in me taking the action of basically ignoring him and his business, and kind of being offended. Yeah? On hindsight, I should have been a bit more aware of my sense making, especially because I got into trouble with this afterwards. I think there's a huge value in being more conscious in how you make sense of especially conflict situation, and that consciousness can open other doors, yeah, that allow more a more constructive approach to a difficult situation. So you can ask yourself, hey, how am I interpreting this situation? Am I jumping to conclusions? How do I get more data to get a better understanding of why people act the way they do? How does my self-perceived identity play a role in this? And really, what are my next steps? And still remain constructive, and remain kind of true to my good intentions. Okay.
Martin, that's awesome. I love how in hindsight you're able to connect your experience with that business leader to your education in the past. Is that an actual return on investment for learning? Let's not go there. But I do like how in the example you just described, you use a number of the root causes we described earlier as reasons for why you got into trouble with this business partner.
Yeah, absolutely. I think if I reflect on the different root causes we spoke about, first of all, there's the style. Yeah, I kind of react very negatively to passive aggressive people. Okay. There's probably also something around objectives, with the business leader having some other priorities. I think there's definitely something around trust. Yeah, me being a corporate guy and perhaps not in his perception adding any value to his business. And then there's certainly that us versus them, corporate versus country operations. Yeah, so yeah, I think those different root causes are a real good explanation for the situation that I found myself in. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think it's going to be really interesting for us next time to go into how we deal with situations like that. So now that we kind of know what the root causes are and we've made sense of it, okay, so how do we fix it or how do we solve it when we're in the middle of it?
Yeah, that sounds like fun. Yeah, and looking forward to our next session to go deep on that. And yeah, thanks everyone for joining us, and looking forward to see you at our next podcast. Bye bye.
Yeah.